to be in it. But I agreed to do an address today because Chris is absent on very important church business in his role as minister in charge of First Church, Rosemary Street. I'm not a preacher, obviously. I'm not even a teacher of religion. I'm an art historian. So I'll start where I always do, well within my comfort zone, with an image. And what you see on the screen is a painting by the 17th century Spanish artist Diego Velázquez, entitled Christ in the House of Martha and Mary, or alternatively, and better I think, kitchen scene with Christ in the house of Martha and Mary, because as you will see, he has concentrated his attention on the scene of presumably Martha in the kitchen doing her domestic work with an old woman companion, and has relegated the scene of Jesus talking to Mary into the background on the sort of top right-hand corner, an opening which has variously been interpreted as a picture on the wall or even a mirror by some, but is generally accepted by experts to be a hatch through into another part of the house where the scene with Jesus and Mary is taking place. So we're looking at the scene from the kitchen. It was painted in about 1618 and it's in the collection of the National Gallery in London. Now, however, you all came to church today for worship, not an art history lesson. So I'm not going to talk about the artist or even the painting's place in the context of Western European art, but rather the subject matter. Jesus in the house of Martha and Mary, as told in Luke 10, as read earlier by Eve. And the story has always fascinated me and even slightly disturbed me. As a very young woman, I felt aggrieved for Martha, thinking that Jesus had rebuked her unfairly when he sided with Mary. After all, he was a visitor in her house, and he would be offered hospitality like every other visitor, and he would no doubt enjoy it. And poor Martha is diligently working away in the kitchen to provide for her guest and see to his needs. Over the years, I've met many women who likewise sided with Martha in the story. One even went as far as to describe herself as a Martha. "I'm definitely a Martha," she declared, probably meaning that she saw herself more as a doer than a talker. And if any of you have watched the TV series The Handmaid's Tale after Margaret Atwood's book of the same title, you'll remember that the domestic servants are called Marthas, and in that they're divested of their individual identities and given this derisively named title. In my own early identification with Martha, I probably imagined Martha as the younger of the two sisters. I have no idea if she was. But I do know how I would have reacted if Jesus had come into my house and held my older sister up to me as a model of good behaviour. Not very well. I remember speaking to Reverend John Rogers of the United Church of Christ in Chicago when we visited there. And I asked him if it was ever feasible to think that Jesus had got something wrong. And he said yes, it was, because after all, Jesus was speaking in a particular time and culture, and we couldn't expect him to be able to anticipate what would be just or appropriate in ours. So I decided back then that while he was in the house of Martha and Mary, Jesus had simply got it wrong. But of course, when you reread a text, and particularly over time, other interpretations can emerge. We often notice this in our book club, for instance, that if we've read a book a long time ago and we read it again, we find our understanding of the plot and the characters has changed with time and with age and presumably wisdom. I would go so far as to suggest that you don't really understand a book until you've read it twice. And I know somebody in our book club always does that. starts off by reading it twice before they even comment. I think that's right. And so now I understand this story differently too. I see that Jesus was not rebuking Martha at all, but he was rather inviting her to join in the discussion and to hear his word, demonstrating that his message was for everyone. He was in fact practicing inclusivity. And in so doing, he was being very radical for his time, a time long before women's rights were on anybody's agenda, and women were excluded from mainly all roles other than the domestic drudgery that they faced daily. It reminds me of an anecdote from my own life, and forgive me if Chris has already told you this story, but it does so well fit here. Years ago, when he was a trade union official, and we had some of his colleagues round for a bite to eat, and I was in the kitchen preparing the food with a friend. She was also a trade unionist, and coincidentally her name was Mary. And the men were in the living room solving the problems of the world, when one of them comes striding into the kitchen to call us in, saying, "This is a very important issue we're discussing. The sisters must have their say." Very laudable sentiment, in fairness to him. But Mary turned to him and said, "Are you joking? The crack is much better out here without you lot. Why do you think women congregate in the kitchen?" So I wonder how Jesus would have reacted to that. But then that's a measure of how times have changed for women, isn't it? However, my new reading of the story of Martha and Mary as one of inclusion still doesn't resolve my unease. Jesus is in the house to speak to the faithful, and he includes everyone in this. So far, so good. But the tea still has to be made, and someone has to do it, as well as all the other chores in the household. Recently, as I'm sure many of you were, I was engrossed in watching the 133 cardinals of the papal conclave gathered in St. Peter's Basilica in their crisply laundered albs. And I have to admit, my first thought was, my goodness, those Vatican nuns are great at ironing. Now, perhaps I'm being unfair, and all those cardinals ironed their own albs, but somehow I doubt it. In fact, I put a fairly substantial bet on it not being the case. However, all this is not to suggest that my interpretation of the story is about the roles of men and women, or who does the lion's share of domestic work. That's not the case. That would be far too trite, I think. And I know many men who do lots of domestic work, and thankfully these days there are lots of women in positions of leadership and authority. Though not in the Catholic Church, sadly, which is one of the reasons why I am no longer a member of the church I was christened into. No, I think we have to look deeper into the text, and perhaps we need to look at the painting too in this regard, because this ostensibly simple kitchen scene can almost be seen as a distillation of centuries of Christian theology. One of the earliest Christian church fathers, St. Augustine of Hippo, who's been talked a lot about recently for obvious reasons, he wrote about the superiority of the contemplative life over the active life. And then, many centuries later, before instigating the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther was a member of the order of the Augustinians. And he drew heavily on Augustine's theology when he wrote that salvation could be obtained through faith alone, granted through the grace of God. However, this view was challenged by the Catholic Church in the Council of Trent in 1545, which began the Counter-Reformation. It stated that a combination of faith and good work was necessary for salvation, quoting the Epistle of James, "Ye see then how that by works a man is justified, and not by faith alone." So the painter in this instance, Velázquez, was a Catholic painter working in the court of a Catholic king, Philip IV of Spain. And the Counter-Reformation, as well as laying down a whole lot of laws for worship and theology, had given specific instructions to painters to reflect that Catholic theology in their work. So his concentration on the work element of this story may indeed reflect this. In addition, of course, his painter's eye would have been drawn to the picturesqueness of the ordinary kitchen scene with its food and utensils and the contrasting physiognomies of the two women. If you're curious as to what Martha is cooking for Jesus, fish, obviously, and fish are a Christian symbol. And it looks like she's making aioli. So fried fish and aioli. He was being well treated in Martha's household, and he should have been grateful. I remember very vividly a sermon preached by Reverend Bill Darlison in our Dublin church. He described the symbolism of the Christian cross, with its vertical axis representing the spirit, which reaches heavenwards, and its horizontal axis representing the soul, reaching out to encompass all in its protection. These two complementary entities, spirit and soul, can be seen to represent faith and practice, belief and action. Some people may be more inclined by personality type or even by training to follow one or other of these paths, inevitably. For those who live a dedicated Christian life, I suppose the difference will be between those who live in secluded orders and spend their days in contemplative prayer, and those who minister to the poor and marginalised on the streets. However, if we look at our Celtic Christian crosses, and there's one on the screen now, this one is Murdoch's High Cross in Monasterboice, County Louth, and it dates from the 9th or 10th century. The point where the two arms of the cross meet is emphasised, encircled in stone. Now, this is thought by experts on one level to have been simply structural, to give it strength. But it also references the celestial sphere. I see it as drawing our attention to the point of perfection, where the two arms meet, a symbiosis of spirit and soul. The majority of us who do not live dedicated Christian lives can only do our best to combine elements of belief and practice, or spirit and soul, as Jesus did, and as Alan's reading referenced earlier. So in the final analysis, I see Martha and Mary almost as two sides of the one woman, with Mary representing the spirit and faith, and Martha representing the soul and practice. And in the combination of the two is found perfection. For all of us, I suppose this means that when we spend our day in prayer or study or contemplation, we should then go and help with the washing up. Amen.